On a frigid November evening in 1981, Raymond Mitchell locked the front entrance of the Harrington Building on K Street in Northwest Washington, adjusted his heavy wool coat against the bitter wind cutting through the nation's capital, and prepared for another unremarkable night of solitude among the empty offices of lawyers, consultants, and trade associations who populated one of the city's most discreet addresses. He had walked these corridors 5 nights a week for 11 years, checking locks and monitoring alarm systems with the methodical precision of a man who understood that security work demanded attention to routine, not excitement. The 53-year-old former Navy machinist believed his most dangerous encounters would involve startling late-working attorneys or confronting the occasional raccoon that had discovered the building's trash compactor. He was catastrophically wrong. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Raymond Mitchell possessed the kind of forgettable face that made him perfect for security work. Average height, thinning brown hair touched with gray, a slight paunch that suggested too many thermos coffees and vending machine sandwiches consumed during long shifts. He lived alone in a studio apartment in Arlington, Virginia, having never married after his Navy sweetheart left him during his second deployment to the Mediterranean in 1956. His life had settled into comfortable patterns. Work 5 nights, sleep through the mornings, spend afternoons watching game shows, and reading paperback westerns at the public library. He had no particular ambitions beyond maintaining his modest salary and avoiding complications. The Harrington Building suited him perfectly. Built in 1968, the 8-story structure occupied a prime location just 3 blocks from the White House, but its architecture was deliberately unremarkable. Gray limestone facade, narrow windows, a lobby decorated in muted browns and beiges that discouraged lingering. The building housed 47 different tenants, mostly small law firms specializing in regulatory work, lobbying groups representing various industries, and consulting firms whose actual business remained vague even to Raymond after a decade of seeing their names on office doors. His supervisor, a retired D.C. police sergeant named Harold Brennan, had hired Raymond in 1970 after his discharge from the Navy and had given him simple instructions that had never changed. Walk every floor twice per shift. Check that all doors are locked. Verify that windows are secure. Test the alarm panels on each level. Note any unusual activity in the logbook. Call the police if you encounter an intruder. Don't touch anything that doesn't concern your duties. It was work that required reliability, not intelligence, and Raymond had performed it without incident for more than 4,000 nights. The building operated on a strict after-hours protocol. All tenants were required to vacate by 7:00 p.m. unless they had filed advance notice with building management. Any late workers had to sign the security log and notify Raymond of their presence. The cleaning crews finished by 9:00 p.m., and after that, the building belonged to Raymond alone. He would spend his shift walking the corridors, sitting in the basement security office reading his paperbacks, and occasionally stepping outside for a cigarette while keeping one eye on the entrance. The most excitement he typically experienced was discovering that someone had left lights on, or finding evidence that teenagers had attempted to break into the parking garage. This particular November evening began with nothing to distinguish it from the 4,000 that had preceded it. Raymond arrived at 6:45 p.m., signed in with the day security guard, and received the standard briefing that nothing unusual had occurred during business hours. He made his first rounds at 7:30 after the last stragglers had departed, checking every floor with his ring of master keys that jangled against his hip with each step. Everything was secure. He returned to the basement office, poured coffee from his thermos, and opened a Louis L'Amour novel he was halfway through. At 10:15 p.m., Raymond began his second walk-through of the evening. This was always his favorite time. The building had fully settled into its nighttime personality, the heating system ticking and humming, the elevator shaft occasionally creaking as the cables adjusted, the windows reflecting the lights of the city outside. He liked the solitude, the sense of being the sole human presence in a space designed for hundreds. He took the elevator to the 8th floor and began working his way down, checking each level systematically. The 7th floor housed 3 law firms and a government relations consulting group. All doors locked, all offices dark. The 6th floor contained more law offices and a firm that did something with international trade regulations. Everything secure. The 5th floor was where Raymond's routine changed forever. Suite 520 belonged to a company called Meridian Research Associates. Raymond had never paid particular attention to them. The frosted glass door bore the company name in simple gold lettering, and the few times he had seen anyone entering or leaving, they had been unremarkable professionals carrying briefcases and dressed in standard business attire. According to his records, the suite had been occupied since 1978. The rent was always paid on time, and the occupants never caused problems. Tonight, the door to Suite 520 was open. Not just unlocked, but standing open perhaps 6 inches, allowing a sliver of light from the interior to spill into the darkened hallway. Raymond stopped, his hand instinctively moving to the heavy flashlight he carried on his belt. He had encountered open doors before, usually because someone had failed to pull them shut properly when leaving. But something about this particular door troubled him. The light inside was dim, not the bright fluorescent illumination that would indicate someone working late, but a softer glow that suggested a desk lamp or perhaps a hallway light left on. He approached slowly, his rubber-soled shoes silent on the polished floor. The building's heating system chose that moment to cycle on, and the sudden rush of air through the vents made him jump slightly, his nerves already on edge for reasons he could not quite articulate. He reached the door and paused, listening. No voices. No sound of movement, only the ambient hum of the building's mechanical systems. Raymond pushed the door open wider and called out, "Security, is anyone here?" His voice echoed slightly in the reception area of Suite 520. No response came. He stepped inside, his flashlight now in hand, though he did not yet turn it on. The reception area was small and professionally decorated. A desk for a secretary, 2 chairs for visitors, a coffee table with neatly arranged magazines, and a door leading to the interior offices. The dim light he had seen was coming from that interior door, which also stood partially open. Raymond's training, such as it was, told him to back out immediately and call the police. An open office after hours could indicate a burglary in progress. But his 11 years of experience also told him that most irregularities had mundane explanations. Someone had probably worked late, forgotten to lock up, and the doors had failed to latch properly. He would check quickly, secure the suite, and note the incident in his logbook. He moved toward the interior door, his hand reaching for the light switch on the wall. Before he could flip it, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a faint electronic beeping, rhythmic and mechanical, coming from somewhere deeper in the office. Not the sound of a telephone or an answering machine, but something else entirely, something that reminded Raymond of equipment he had maintained during his Navy years. Signal processors and radio equipment that filled the communications rooms on the destroyers where he had served. He pushed through the interior door and found himself in a hallway with 4 offices branching off it. 3 of the office doors were closed. The fourth, at the end of the hall, was open and was the source of both the light and the beeping sound. Raymond approached with growing unease. Every instinct he possessed was now screaming at him to leave, to call the police, to let someone with actual authority handle whatever this was. But another part of him, the part that had spent 20 years in the Navy, following orders and investigating irregularities in ship systems, pushed him forward. He needed to know what he was looking at before he made a report. The office at the end of the hall was larger than the others, probably meant for a senior partner or executive. But instead of the standard desk, filing cabinets, and bookshelves Raymond expected, he found something that transformed his understanding of what Meridian Research Associates actually did. The room had been converted into something resembling a radio communications center. 3 large metal desks were arranged in a U-shape, each supporting equipment that Raymond recognized from his Navy days. Radio receivers, signal processors, what appeared to be cipher machines, and several devices whose purpose he could not immediately identify. Reels of magnetic tape sat beside a recording device. Stacks of paper filled wire baskets on each desk. A large map of the Washington, D.C. area covered one wall, marked with colored pins and notations in what appeared to be a foreign script. The beeping sound came from one of the radio receivers, its amber indicator light pulsing in rhythm with the electronic tone. Raymond stood in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was not a normal office. This was not the kind of equipment a legitimate consulting firm would need. This looked like the communications room on a warship, or more accurately, like the intelligence-gathering stations he had occasionally glimpsed during his service when delivering parts to restricted areas of the vessels he worked on. His first thought was that perhaps Meridian Research Associates was some kind of government contractor, maybe doing communications work for one of the intelligence agencies that proliferated throughout Washington. But if that were the case, why was the office in a commercial building? Why wasn't this equipment in a secure government facility? And why had the door been left open? Raymond took a step into the room, drawn by a curiosity that overrode his growing fear. He moved to the nearest desk and examined the papers in the wire basket. They appeared to be typed reports, single-spaced, with headers that included dates and what looked like reference codes. He could not read most of the text, which was in a language he did not recognize, but some documents had English notations in the margins. The words he could make out sent ice through his veins. Naval communications, diplomatic cables, Pentagon scheduling, embassy personnel movements. These were intelligence reports, and unless he was very much mistaken, they were intelligence reports being prepared for transmission to someone who was not supposed to have them. Raymond's hands began to shake. He had stumbled into something far beyond his experience or authority. This was espionage. This was exactly the kind of Soviet spy operation he had read about in the newspapers, the kind that led to trials and prison sentences and occasionally to executions. And he was standing in the middle of it, alone, at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, with his only weapon a flashlight and a canister of pepper spray that had probably expired years ago. He backed away from the desk, his mind racing through options. He needed to leave immediately, needed to call the police or the FBI or someone who knew how to handle this situation. But as he turned to exit the room, he heard the sound he had been dreading. The elevator. Someone was coming up to the 5th floor. Raymond froze, his breath catching in his throat. The elevator doors opened with their characteristic ding, and he heard footsteps in the corridor outside Suite 520. Not running, not hurried, but walking with the confidence of someone who belonged here. Multiple sets of footsteps, at least 2 people, possibly 3. They were speaking to each other in low voices, and even from a distance, Raymond could tell they were not speaking English. He looked around the office desperately, searching for somewhere to hide. The desk was too open, offering no concealment. There was no closet, no bathroom, just the radio equipment and furniture. His only option was to press himself against the wall beside the door and hope the newcomers would not enter this particular office immediately. The footsteps grew closer, moving through the reception area and into the interior hallway. Raymond could now hear the conversation more clearly, and while he did not understand the language, he recognized it from war movies and news broadcasts. Russian. They were speaking Russian. Two men entered the hallway, still talking. Raymond, pressed against the wall just inside the office door, could see their shadows cast by the light from the office behind him. They were moving slowly, checking the other offices, and had not yet noticed that the communications room was occupied or that the building's security guard was currently trapped inside. Raymond's heart hammered so hard he feared they would hear it. His mouth had gone completely dry, and he could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the building's cool temperature. He had no training for this situation. No protocol covered what to do when you accidentally discovered a Soviet spy operation and then got trapped inside while the spies returned. One of the men said something that sounded like a question. The other responded, and their footsteps moved toward the office where Raymond was hiding. He pressed himself flatter against the wall, trying to control his breathing, trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. The first man appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the hall light. He was approximately 40 years old, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase. He took 2 steps into the room before he saw Raymond. For perhaps 2 seconds, the two men stared at each other in mutual shock. Then several things happened very quickly. The Soviet agent's hand moved inside his overcoat, reaching for something. Raymond, operating on pure instinct and adrenaline, swung his heavy metal flashlight in a wide arc that connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. The agent collapsed immediately, his briefcase falling to the floor and spilling papers across the carpet. The second agent, alerted by the sound, rushed into the doorway. Raymond did not give him time to react. He drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, using his 200 pounds to bull rush him back into the hallway. They crashed against the opposite wall, and Raymond brought his knee up hard into the man's groin. The agent doubled over with a gasp, and Raymond hit him with the flashlight too, a glancing blow to the side of the head that sent him sprawling to the floor. Raymond did not wait to see if either man would recover. He ran. He sprinted down the hallway, through the reception area, and out into the building corridor. His mind was blank with panic, operating on pure survival instinct. He hit the stairwell door at full speed and took the stairs down 3 at a time, his keys jangling wildly against his hip. He burst into the basement level, ran to the security office, and grabbed the phone with shaking hands. He dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he could barely form coherent words. "This is Raymond Mitchell, security guard at the Harrington Building on K Street. I need police immediately. I've been attacked. There are foreign agents. They have radio equipment. Just send everyone." The operator, to her credit, did not question his confused report. She told him units were being dispatched and to stay on the line. But Raymond was already moving again, driven by a fear that the two agents would recover and come after him. He grabbed his coat and ran out the back entrance of the building into the November cold, putting distance between himself and whatever he had discovered on the 5th floor. He stood in the alley behind the building, the phone's cord pulled taut through the doorway, still connected to the operator who was asking him questions he could barely process. His entire body was shaking, adrenaline coursing through his system, his mind replaying the last 10 minutes in vivid flashes. The equipment, the documents, the Russian voices, the violence he had never imagined himself capable of. The first police cruiser arrived 4 minutes later, followed quickly by 3 more. Officers found Raymond in the alley, still clutching the phone, still babbling about Russian agents and spy equipment. They were skeptical at first, clearly thinking they were dealing with a mentally disturbed security guard having some kind of episode. But Raymond's genuine terror was convincing enough that they agreed to investigate. 6 officers entered the building with Raymond, who led them up to the 5th floor. Suite 520's door still stood open. The officers drew their weapons and entered tactically, clearing each room. The reception area was empty. The interior offices were empty, and the communications room at the end of the hall was empty. One of the Soviet agents was gone. The other, the one Raymond had hit first, was still there, unconscious and bleeding from the head wound Raymond's flashlight had inflicted. But everything else had changed. The radio equipment was still in place, too large and complex to remove quickly. But the papers were gone. The magnetic tapes were gone. The map with its colored pins had been torn from the wall, leaving only tack holes. The wire baskets sat empty. Someone had taken approximately 10 minutes, while Raymond was calling for help to remove every piece of evidence that was small enough to carry. The police sergeant in charge looked at Raymond with new seriousness. He radioed for detectives and told Raymond that he needed to tell his story again, in detail, to people who would know what to do with it. Raymond sat in the reception area of Suite 520, still shaking, and tried to explain what he had seen before it had been sanitized. The equipment descriptions came easily, his Navy training providing the technical vocabulary, but the documents were harder to describe, their contents already fading from his panicked memory like details from a nightmare. Within 20 minutes, federal agents arrived. Raymond never learned which agency they represented, FBI, CIA, or some other acronym he had never heard of. They were men in dark suits with credentials they flashed too quickly for him to read properly, speaking with the authority of people accustomed to obedience. They took control of the scene from the local police, who seemed relieved to hand over responsibility for whatever this was becoming. Raymond was escorted to a government building he did not recognize, somewhere in Foggy Bottom, where he spent the next 7 hours answering questions from a rotating series of interrogators. They were not unkind, but they were relentlessly thorough, asking him to describe every detail of what he had seen, every word he had overheard, every document he had glimpsed. They showed him photographs of faces, dozens of them, asking if he recognized any as the men from Suite 520. He identified one with certainty, a man whose picture was in a file marked with red tabs and Cyrillic notations. They showed him technical diagrams of equipment, asking him to identify what he had seen in the communications room. Raymond did his best, pointing out receivers and cipher machines that matched his memories. They asked about Meridian Research Associates, about who came and went from Suite 520, about whether he had ever noticed anything suspicious before tonight. Raymond felt increasingly foolish admitting that he had walked past this office for 3 years without ever suspecting anything unusual. They should have found someone more observant for this security job, he thought. Someone who would have noticed sooner that something was wrong. But the lead interrogator, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Carlson, assured Raymond that he had done nothing wrong. "These operations are designed to be invisible," Carlson said. "The people running them are professionals who have trained for years to blend into American society. You had no reason to suspect anything until you saw direct evidence. And when you did see that evidence, you acted correctly. You reported it immediately. You did not try to handle it yourself beyond defending yourself when attacked. You may have disrupted a significant espionage operation, Mr. Mitchell. That's considerably more than most security guards accomplish in their entire careers." The interrogation finally ended at dawn. Raymond was taken back to the Harrington Building, where federal agents had spent the night processing Suite 520 as a crime scene. The radio equipment had been photographed, disassembled, and removed. Technicians in white suits were dusting for fingerprints and collecting fiber evidence. The other offices in the suite had been searched, revealing more equipment hidden behind false walls in what should have been a storage closet. The unconscious Soviet agent had been taken away. Raymond never learned what happened to him, though he read in the newspaper 3 weeks later about a Soviet embassy employee who was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States for engaging in activities incompatible with his diplomatic status. Raymond was told to go home and rest, but that he should not discuss what had happened with anyone. Not his supervisor, not his neighbors, not even his family, if he had any. National security concerns required absolute discretion. They would be in touch soon with further instructions. Raymond returned to his Arlington apartment as morning traffic began filling the streets. He sat in his worn armchair and stared at the wall, trying to process what had happened to him. His hands still shook slightly when he tried to pour coffee. His head ached from stress and exhaustion, and his mind kept returning to that moment in the office when he had seen the Soviet agent reach inside his coat. Raymond had assumed the man was reaching for a weapon. Maybe he had been. Maybe Raymond had saved his own life by striking first. Or maybe the man had been reaching for identification, for some explanation that would have diffused the confrontation. Raymond would never know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. The FBI, for it turned out to be the FBI who had taken over the investigation, contacted Raymond 2 days later. He was asked to come to their Washington field office for what they called a debriefing session. Special Agent Carlson, whose first name Raymond now learned was David, explained what the Bureau had discovered. Meridian Research Associates was a front company established by Soviet intelligence, specifically the GRU, which handled military intelligence operations. The suite had been operating as a signals intelligence collection station for approximately 3 years, exactly as long as Raymond had been walking past it without suspicion. The equipment Raymond had seen was sophisticated Soviet-manufactured gear designed to intercept and decode American military and diplomatic communications. The location had been chosen carefully. The Harrington buildings, close enough to government facilities to pick up radio transmissions, but far enough from obvious targets to avoid the kind of intensive security screenings that buildings nearer to the Pentagon or White House received. The individuals running the operation had used various covers. Some posed as consultants, others as researchers, all of them with carefully constructed American identities supported by forged documents and legends that had been years in the making. The agent Raymond had struck, and who had been captured, was a GRU officer named Mikhail Volkov, operating under the identity of Michael Volker, supposedly a communications consultant. Volkov had been under FBI surveillance for 6 months, but the Bureau had not known about the Harrington building operation until Raymond's call. They had been following him to identify his network, and Raymond's discovery had accelerated the timeline, forcing them to act before they had mapped all the connections. "Your intervention actually helped us," Agent Carlson said. "We were able to detain Volkov before he could be extracted by his handlers. He's providing some cooperation in exchange for avoiding a lengthy prison sentence. And the equipment we seized is giving our technical people insights into current Soviet intercept capabilities." The second agent, the one who escaped, was identified as Viktor Lachenko, another GRU officer. He had fled the building while Raymond was calling police, taking with him whatever documents he could carry. The FBI believed he had gone to ground somewhere in the Washington area, likely being sheltered by other members of the spy network, while his superiors arranged to smuggle him out of the country. Agent Carlson told Raymond that he would likely be called to testify if the case went to trial, though he suspected the government would prefer a quiet deportation to a public proceeding that would reveal how much the Soviets had learned about American communications security. Raymond asked the question that had been troubling him since that night. Was I wrong to hit them? Should I have just run? Carlson's expression softened. Mr. Mitchell, you were alone in a room with trained intelligence officers who were engaged in espionage against your country. When Volkov reached into his coat, you had every reason to believe he was drawing a weapon. You defended yourself with appropriate force. The fact that you then chose to flee and call for help, rather than attempting to apprehend them both, shows good judgment. You're a security guard, not a federal agent. You did exactly what you should have done. But Raymond could not shake the memory of the flashlight connecting with Volkov's skull, the sickening sound of metal on bone, the way the man had collapsed instantly. Raymond had never hurt anyone before, not even in bar fights during his Navy days. Now he had potentially killed someone, or at least inflicted serious injury, and regardless of the justification, it weighed on him. The FBI kept Raymond informed as the investigation progressed. Additional arrests were made as the Bureau followed the threads connecting to the Harrington Building operation. 4 other suspected GRU officers were identified and expelled from the country. 3 American citizens were charged with espionage for providing support to the network. And a number of what the FBI called persons of interest were placed under intensive surveillance, their phones tapped and their movements tracked. The scope of what Raymond had accidentally exposed became clearer. The Harrington Building Station had been one of several similar operations the GRU was running in Washington. They had established listening posts in commercial buildings throughout the city, places where sophisticated radio equipment could be installed and operated without attracting the attention that similar setups in embassies or consulates would generate. The intelligence they gathered was extensive. Intercepts of military communications, recordings of diplomatic phone calls, decoded messages between government agencies. For 3 years, they had been siphoning secrets from the heart of American government, and they might have continued indefinitely if Raymond had not checked his rounds 15 minutes earlier than usual, catching them during one of their operational sessions. Raymond returned to work at the Harrington Building a week after the incident, though Suite 520 now stood empty, its lease terminated and its contents removed by federal agents. He found it difficult to walk the 5th-floor corridor without remembering that night. He would stand outside the suite, now locked and vacant, and wonder what he had prevented. How much damage had been stopped by his accidental discovery? How many American secrets had been preserved because he had insisted on checking an open door rather than assuming someone had simply forgotten to lock up properly? His supervisor, Harold Brennan, had been briefed by the FBI and had been ordered to tell Raymond that he had done exceptional work. Brennan, a practical man not given to displays of emotion, had simply shaken Raymond's hand and said the company was proud of him. But Raymond could see the question in Brennan's eyes. Why had it taken 3 years for someone to notice? How had Soviet spies operated in their building without any of the security staff detecting them? The question haunted Raymond, too. He began paying more attention during his rounds, noting details he had previously overlooked. He realized that he had been performing his duties mechanically, following the checklist without truly observing. The Soviet agents had counted on that mechanical routine, had built their security around the assumption that the night guard would check doors and move on without deeper investigation. They had been right for 3 years. They had only been wrong on the one night when Raymond happened to find a door open at the precise moment they were inside. The randomness of it troubled him, What if he had started his rounds 5 minutes later? What if they had been more careful about securing the door? What if he had simply assumed the door had failed to latch and locked it without entering? The whole thing could easily have never happened, and the spy operation would have continued until the Soviets chose to shut it down, or until some other random accident exposed it. 2 months after the incident, Raymond was called to FBI headquarters again. This time it was not for questioning, but to receive formal recognition for his role in disrupting the espionage operation. He was presented with a letter of commendation from the bureau director, praising his vigilance and his decision to report suspicious activity immediately. The letter was classified and could never be shown to anyone, but Raymond was told he should be proud of his service to national security. He was also told that Viktor Lichenko, the agent who had escaped, had been located attempting to board a cargo ship in Baltimore. He had been arrested and was now in federal custody awaiting trial or exchange. The entire network that had supported the Harrington Building operation had been rolled up, dismantled through patient investigation that followed the connections Raymond's discovery had revealed. Agent Carlson walked Raymond out of the building after the ceremony. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Mitchell," Carlson said. "What you did was not extraordinary in the sense of requiring special skills or training. You simply paid attention, followed your instincts when something seemed wrong, and reported what you found to proper authorities. But in the world of counterintelligence, those simple actions are exactly what we need from citizens. You weren't trying to be a hero. You were just doing your job correctly. And that made all the difference." Raymond thought about those words during his long shifts walking the corridors of the Harrington Building. He had stumbled into history by accident, had played a role in the hidden war between superpowers without intending to, and his life had been permanently altered by 10 minutes of fear and violence on a November night. The building seemed different to him now. He looked at every office door differently, wondering what might be hidden behind the professional nameplates and frosted glass. He paid attention to the tenants in ways he never had before, noting who came and went at unusual hours, who carried equipment that seemed inconsistent with their stated business. Harold Brennan noticed the change and pulled Raymond aside one afternoon. "You can't spend the rest of your career seeing spies in every shadow," Brennan said. "What you found was real, but it was also rare." Most of these offices contain exactly what they appear to contain: lawyers preparing briefs, consultants writing reports, people doing ordinary work. You did your job correctly when it mattered. Don't let that one experience make you paranoid about everything else. But Raymond could not shake the awareness that had been forced upon him. The Cold War, which he had understood mainly through news reports about missiles in Cuba and conflicts in Vietnam, had been happening right in front of him for 3 years without his knowledge. Soviet intelligence officers had been walking past him in the lobby, had probably exchanged pleasantries with him on elevators, had existed as part of the building's daily population while conducting espionage that could have contributed to American deaths in some future conflict. The realization that enemies could hide so effectively among the ordinary details of daily life was profoundly unsettling. Raymond continued working security at the Harrington Building for another 8 years, retiring in 1989 at the age of 61. He never encountered another spy operation, never discovered another room filled with Soviet communications equipment. His remaining years of service were exactly as mundane as his first 11 had been, checking locks and monitoring alarm systems without incident. But he remained vigilant in ways he had not been before that November night. He checked every open door thoroughly. He noted every irregularity. He maintained awareness of his surroundings with an intensity that occasionally made his fellow security guards comment that he seemed jumpy. The Cold War ended during his final years of work. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And the threat that had shaped Raymond's adult life simply dissolved, as though it had never existed. He read about these events in the newspaper and felt a strange mixture of relief and displacement. The enemy he had accidentally fought against no longer existed as a political entity. The GRU officers he had confronted were presumably back in Moscow, dealing with the collapse of the system they had served. The elaborate spy networks that had been constructed in Washington and other Western cities were being dismantled or repurposed as the new Russian government tried to position itself as a potential partner rather than an adversary. Raymond never learned the full scope of what his discovery had prevented. The FBI's after-action reports remained classified. The intelligence assessments of the damage the Harrington Building operation had caused before its exposure were never shared with him. He knew only that he had done his job correctly at a moment when it mattered, and that the simple act of checking an open door had set in motion events that rippled through the intelligence communities of two superpowers. In his retirement, living in the same Arlington apartment where he had lived as a working man, Raymond occasionally thought about Mikhail Volkov, the GRU officer whose skull he had struck with his flashlight. He wondered if Volkov had recovered fully from the injury, whether he had been traded back to the Soviet Union in one of the spy exchanges that periodically made headlines, whether he was still alive in the new Russia that had emerged from the Soviet collapse. Raymond felt no particular animosity toward the man. Volkov had been doing his job, just as Raymond had been doing his. They had simply been on opposite sides of a conflict neither of them had chosen, and circumstances had forced them into violent confrontation. The FBI maintained periodic contact with Raymond even in retirement, calling every few years to check on his well-being and to remind him that his story remained classified. He was asked not to discuss the incident with anyone, not to write about it, not to share details that might compromise ongoing counterintelligence operations or reveal methods that were still in use. Raymond had no desire to talk about it anyway. His brief involvement in espionage had given him nothing he wanted to remember: fear, violence, and the knowledge that he had lived in ignorance while enemies operated around him. These were not stories he wished to tell. He died in 2008 at the age of 80. His role in disrupting a Soviet intelligence operation known to only a handful of FBI agents and the intelligence analysts who had studied the Harrington Building case in classified reports. His obituary in the Arlington newspaper noted that he had been a Navy veteran and a longtime security guard, a man who had lived quietly and bothered no one. There was no mention of spy operations or confrontations with GRU officers. The certificate of commendation from the FBI director remained in a sealed envelope in Raymond's desk drawer, unread by the nephew who cleared out his apartment after his death. The full story of the Harrington Building operation was finally declassified in 2015, more than 30 years after the incident, as part of a broader release of Cold War intelligence documents. Historians studying Soviet espionage operations in the United States discovered references to the case in files detailing GRU activities during the 1970s and 1980s. They noted it as an example of how luck and timing often played crucial roles in counterintelligence successes, how the most sophisticated operations could be undone by simple accidents, like an open door and a curious security guard. The case became a teaching example in intelligence training programs. It illustrated the importance of security consciousness among civilian personnel, demonstrated how espionage operations relied on the assumption that people would not look too closely at ordinary details, and showed that vigilance mattered even in the most routine contexts. Every security guard, every maintenance worker, Every person with access to buildings and facilities had a role to play in national security, whether they realized it or not. Raymond Mitchell had played his role perfectly without knowing he was in the game. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.